Hola, qui hi ha? Bon dia a tothom. Comencem aquesta taula rodona, aquest seminari. Ho farem avui, donant la paraula en primer lloc en el Marc Sant Jaume, el professor Marc Sant Jaume, que farà la presentació del seminari i també del nostre ponent i del nostre discassa. Quan vulguis.
Molt bé, doncs bon dia a tothom, moltes gràcies per assistir en aquest seminari. Com saben, des de fa uns quants mesos estem fent seminaris que els diem seminari obert per discutir treballs acadèmics nous, qüestions que ens interessen de recerca en temes d'autogovern i en les qüestions que l'Institut sempre ha treballat. Si m'ho permeten, continuaré en anglès per deferència al nostre ponent d'avui. Today we invited Professor Shackle. He's an assistant professor at Maastricht University, and he's going to talk about how to measure sub-state or regional authority across countries. In this case, in fact, we focus on a very, very political science perspective. So what he aims at is measuring self-government through numbers. So we will see an index of regional authority in this presentation, which is not a standard approach, I would say, from a legal perspective. It's more a political science perspective. We are interested on this topic. We have always been interested in measuring self-government, but the last November we already presented an article in New Delhi in the International Association of Centers of Federal Studies comparing indicators. In this case, we talked about a bunch of indicators that exist in the field of political science. And I should say that the indicator that we will see today and the works that we will see today of Professor Shackle are among the best works in the field. I should say that we have with us a leading scholar of the field in this seminar. So thank you for coming. Professor Shackle is co-author of a recent book talking about this index entitled A Post-Functionalist Theory of Governance, and he has also published with other co-authors, Lisbeth Huge, Gary Marks, and others, many articles, and he recently published an article on secession and autonomy in a prestigious journal called Party Politics, with Emanuele Massetti. In order to get feedback with some expertise, I would say, on the topic, we have also invited Professor Fran Requejo. You all know Professor Fran Requejo. He's a full professor of Pompeu Fabra University. He's an expert on federalism and has published several books on the topic, also here Institute that studies autogovern, and we think it's a good opportunity to have him on board in this seminar, and we thank him to accept being the discussant of Professor Shackle's presentation. Let me remind you that we have been very active on social media. We have a Twitter account which is called Autogovern Cat, and feel free to publicize or to tweet on this event. We are trying to expand our social media network to reach more academics and scholars and civil servants and people that are interested on our works. Professor Shackle, it's your turn. I will stop you in 45 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, to zit in. If you don't mind, I rather stand up while I present, and I walk around a bit because it helps me think while I'm delivering this presentation. And thanks a lot for inviting me here to present the Regional Authority Index, which is a measurement of regions, the autonomy for regions in a broad comparative perspective. And yeah, I'm particularly looking forward to present you this index because it provides, you are experts on the autonomy for Catalonia, and I'm really interested on your feedback on how we measure autonomy for Catalonia and whether you think we missed out on something important or not. But before we can come to that, let me first present to you what I will do during this presentation. First, I will discuss the measurement itself. And then in a second step, I want to use this measurement to do two things. How does Catalonia score against the benchmark of the measurement itself? How does Catalonia then score in relation to other comunidades within Spain, according to this measurement, but also outside Spain? And what are the peers of Catalonia? And what is then different between Catalonia and its peers? And then, while doing that, I think the measurement can tell us something about possible future scenarios for the autonomy for Catalonia. So I hope that, yeah, by applying this measurement, I can hopefully contribute to the debates you are having here, and by bringing in the comparative perspective. So what does this measurement do? It measures authority for regions, for regional governments. But the first thing what the scientist then needs to do is to think about authority as a concept. What is it? How is it conceptualized? And what we did in this measurement was basically a simple thought experiment. As a citizen in a particular country, let's say Spain, and you look up and you ask yourself the question, who can determine what I can or cannot do in this territory? Right? And then the citizen looks up. What the citizen then will see in Spain is first the municipal level, municipio in Spanish. Then it's some comunidades comarcas, right? Also here in Catalonia, if I'm not mistaken. And then authority exercised by the regional government over citizens within the territorial boundaries of that region. So this is how most people would think about authority. But if you think about regional governments in a political system, they also exercise authority in a different way. And that is in a kind of power-sharing arrangements. And so regional governments also exercise authority in the territory of Spain as a whole. So one way where this happens is in the Senate. The regional, or the assemblies of the autonomous comunidades elect representatives in the Senate. And the Senate has some impact on national legislation. So, if you think about this, the Catalan parliament, through its representatives in the Senate, can have an impact on legislation, national legislation, which applies across the whole of Spain. It's also in Andalusia. So the Catalan citizens, through the representatives in the Catalan parliament, exercise in the end authority over citizens in Andalusia. Right? And I'm emphasizing this a bit because it can raise more normative questions about democracy itself. But that's not all of it. Federal or central governments can meet with regional governments to discuss the implementation of national legislation. Right? And this often happens in intergovernmental meetings, whereby the federal minister, let's say for health, meets with regional ministers. Either national legislation and how it will be coordinated and implemented in the regions, or the regional parliaments, the regional governments meet to coordinate their own competences. Now, this is also authority exercised by regional governments. And this is what we label then shared rule, because it's always shared in relation with central government as well as other regional governments. So if we want to measure the power exercised by regional government, we need to take account of the fact that regional governments can exercise their authority in two ways, through the self-rule component and through the shared rule component. So self-rule is the authority that the subnational government exercises in its own territory. And then we break it down in various sub-dimensions, because we can identify various aspects of what government do and how government can exercise authority. So we look at the extent to which a regional government is autonomous from the central government. It's not a deconcentrated central government outpost, just implementing whatever the central government demands. The range of policies for which the regional government is responsible for. Is it only a bit of tourism, or is it also education and health and the like? What are its tax autonomy powers? Can the regional government tax only tourists and dogs, which generates very little revenue? Or can it also tax corporate and personal income or value-added taxes, which are major revenue sources? To what extent can the regional government borrow? Right? Get access to money. And in a far, are there proper democratic elected institutions at the regional level? Now similarly, with regard to the shared rule component, which is the authority that the subnational government co-exercises in the country as a whole, you can break it down into various subcomponents. So in a far, can regional representatives or governments co-determine national legislation, often through an upper chamber of parliament. How much national policy coordination implementation is taking place in these intergovernmental meetings, executive control? How are national tax revenues distributed? And do regional governments have a say in that distribution and allocation of tax revenues? Similarly for borrowing. In how far is borrowing coordinated between central and regional governments? And finally, constitutional change. The basic institutional setup of a country. And do regional governments have a say in constitutional reform? Now what we do in the measurement, and Mark already said this, as a quantitative measure. And to be a bit more precise and a bit more technical, it's an ordinal measure, whereby higher points, higher numbers, indicate more authority for a regional government. And to be a bit more precise, higher points indicate more authority, but the difference between the points is not always the same. This is a mathematical, technical aspect of an ordinal measure in contrast to a continuous measure. So, what we just basically did is, according to each of these subdimensions, allocate points. So, for example, for fiscal autonomy, when a regional government can only tax tourists and dogs, we give it a 1. It has some tax authority, but not a lot. But as soon as the regional government can tax personal and corporate income, then it's a major revenue source, right? And then it can get a 3 or even up to a 4. And then we just add all these scores, and then you get a maximum score of 30, and that's really the high end of our measurement. And then the highest for Salvo is 18, and the highest for Shelter is 12 points. Now, the reason, first this, we have done this for all regional governments in 42 OECD countries. So all regions, we define a regional tier as a government in between local, the lowest level, and a national central level of government. So we also scored in Spain the provincias. We also scored the comarcas. And we also assigned points to those. And the autonomous comunidades. As soon as a regional tier or a region serves more than 150,000 citizens, it is the lower end of the NUTS 3 classification, if you're familiar with that classification scheme, then you're being scored. And we do that on an annual basis since 1950. Now, the nice thing about once you do this kind of exercise is that you can trace regional authority over time across a whole range of countries. And this is where we can bring in the comparative perspective. So as soon as you want to compare, because we're now talking about close to 400 regions, 500 regions in those 42 countries, times 60 years, right? If you want to do that in a qualitative way, right, you will end up with a magnificent load of number of pages. The nice thing about using numbers is that you can get this comparative oversight relatively easy once you have the numbers, right? It's a lot of work to do the coding. Once you have it, you can do very nice overviews, like this graph. So what you see here is an average of the regional authority index score for a group of countries which we have labeled EU as old democracies. So, the old EU member states. Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands. Alright, I need to put this closer. Okay. And what you then see over time is that there has been a clear increase in regional authority. From an average about 11 points up to an average of 15 points here. This is the second group of countries which we labeled EU as new democracies. Portugal, Cyprus, Malta, Greece, but also Spain. And what you can see here is that during authoritarian times, regional authority was, let's say, suffocated, was kept at a low level, and then with democratization, regional authority increased as well. And then if we look at EU post-communist countries, let's say the 2004 Big Bang accession round, then we see a similar trend. So after communist rule, many of these countries wanted to get rid of the communist institutional past, so they eradicated some of these institutions and then build it up slowly until this level. Now we started this project when I was doing my PhD, and in my PhD I wanted to assess in how far European integration was actually increasing multi-level governance. In order to tackle that question, I wanted to compare the regional authority within the EU, but also to countries outside the EU. So that's why the 42 countries, what you see here in this line, are also former communist countries, but who are not member, at least not currently, member of the European Union. And then you also see, after communist rule, a sharp increase of regional authority with democratization. And then, more recently, a sharp decline, but that's mostly Russia. Let's say the Putin being in power at the moment. And this is already, I think, one of the nice things these measures can reveal, is the relationship between democracy and regional authority. Right? And how regional government can contribute to democracy. Now the real interesting bit in the perspective of my PhD thesis, at least back then, was this following line. This line is for OECD countries which are not part of the EU. Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia. And what you then can see is that also in these countries, regional authority has increased over time. And this was for me already a clear indication that regional authority has been increasing within and outside the EU. So the extent to which the EU facilitates regional authority within the EU, right, is already put into a different light. Namely that probably regional authority, increasing regional authority, has multiple causes, and European integration can be one of those, but surely it's not the only one. And perhaps it doesn't have a role at all. There's a third factor, another factor, which is driving the increase of regional authority in the developed world. So this is, let's say, the background and the context of the measurement and its development. What I would like to do now is have a closer look at Catalonia and then compare it to regions within Spain, but also outside Spain. Now here you see a similar graph. So regional authority index score and a line for now Navarra. And what you then can see with democratization, a sharp increase in regional authority, and then the mid-80s a reform, and then late 90s another reform. Okay, this is not working?
You can sit here to the screen. I'm very sorry.
No problem.
They cannot translate it.
Okay, I need to sit down. That's fine. So this is the Basque Country, another line. And now you may wonder, why has the Basque Country a lower score than Navarra? The reason is because the fueros lie at the, or are in the competence of the provinces, and not the autonomous comunidades. And so here we see how the regional authority index also, why it's important to measure the different governmental tiers separately. Right? Now, and here is then the red line, Catalonia. A sharp increase with democratization, and then a number of reforms during the 80s and the 90s. And now the final line, the fourth line, the non-historic, the other autonomous comunidades. What you then can right away see is that this line overlaps with Catalonia. Right? So at the start, with democratization, Catalonia had its own trajectory in terms of autonomy. But later on, it was put into a similar institutional mold with the other autonomous comunidades. More on that a bit later. Now, what you see in this table is the 5 self-rule dimensions and the 5 shared rule dimensions, the maximum score on those subdimensions, the maximum score according to the measurement, the benchmark, and then how Catalonia scores. What you then can see is where Catalonia could potentially increase its authority according to the index. Policy scope, fiscal autonomy, and borrowing autonomy. And on the shared rule side, lawmaking, 1.5 points, and fiscal control, 1 point. On all these other dimensions, Catalonia already scores the maximum, at least according to our measurement. What you see in this table is Catalonia in comparison to its peers, other highly autonomous regions in Europe. And then what you can see is that some regions do score higher on the self-rule dimension than Catalonia. And this can be interesting because we can have a look at these regions, how they have organized their autonomy and authority, because they can provide ways, perhaps even best examples for Catalonia, how authority can be implemented here to get this extra authority. So, what I would like to do now, this you know of course, Catalonia, I want to compare or discuss these other regions which score higher on these particular subdimensions than Catalonia. So here we have Holland, there we have the Faroe Islands, and this of course you know, Navarra. So Ireland. Ireland scores higher on policy scope, and the difference between the 3 and the 4 on this subdimension is control over immigration, citizenship rights, and the like. And Ireland scores 4 on this. And why does Ireland scores 4? Because they have the right of domicile. And so Ireland is a region within Finland, but the people there speak Swedish. Now, when you have this right of domicile in Ireland, then you can participate in the democratic institutions, and you can own property on the island. And if you don't have this right of domicile, you can't vote, you can't own property on the island. So that's quite significant autonomy. And I don't think many people within Europe realize that, how much authority this little island can exercise. It's a small island. I think it doesn't have more than 50,000 inhabitants on the island. Now, how do you get this right? Either at birth, or you have lived in Ireland more than 5 years, and you have a certain proficiency in the Swedish language. Right? And this is rules set by the Ireland Parliament, Ireland government itself. And if you leave the island, you will also run at the risk of losing the right of domicile. So it's really controlling Who's part of the community or not? Another subdimension, fiscal autonomy, Navarra. I guess most of you will be familiar with the fueros and how it's organized here. But let me just go over it just to be sure. Now, the difference between the 3 and the 4 is the extent to whether the regional government can not only set the rate of an important tax, but can also set the base of one of the major taxes. What do we mean by setting the rate versus setting the base? Setting the rate is very simple, the percentage, 5%, 10%, 50% of income tax. Why is the base a more important competence? Because the base determines what counts as income. What should be included when applying the rate? Is interest, is that part of income or not? Etc. Now, Navarra has the right to collect all these major taxes, and it can also set the base and rate of these taxes. And then what happens, in contrast to the other comunidades autónomas, is Navarra collects it and then gives a portion of the collected tax revenue to the central government. Whereas for the other autonomous comunidades, right, the central government gives a portion of the tax revenue to the autonomous comunidades. And that's, of course, a very different arrangement, right? If you have your own bag of money, you collect it and you give a portion away, right? That is far more, that you have far more control over your authority, tax authority, than all the way around. Borrowing autonomy, Ireland and the Faroe Islands. So the maximum score is allocated to a region that really can borrow without any centrally imposed limitations. And often the way it's organized legally, it's very simple. Right? So take, for example, the Act on the Autonomy of Ireland. Just one sentence, right? We just can borrow money whenever we need to. Or take the Faroe Islands. As soon as the parliament says it's okay, and we're going to borrow money. Right? So the Finnish government and the Danish government do not impose any restrictions on borrowing. This is what these islands do themselves. The shared rule dimension. Again, what you see here in this table is Catalonia, its scores on the 5 shared rule dimensions, and then compared to its peers, other autonomous or powerful regions within Europe. Then we can see that in this comparison, the Spanish regions score actually quite high. I will give you an explanation for that later on. But first I want to see where is there potentially more authority to be gained for Catalonia, and how could certain autonomy arrangements look like. So for lawmaking, we can have a look at Scotland and Wales, because they score 1.5 instead of a half a point in Catalonia. And for fiscal control, we can look at Navarra and the Basque Country within Spain. So where are these regions? Of course, Scotland and Wales in the northern west periphery, and these you know, of course. Now, what kind of, so you score half a point, Catalonia scores half a point on shared rule. And why is that? Well, you elect your representatives into the Senate, but these senators representing the autonomous comunidades comunidades autónomas, they represent a minority. The majority of the senators are elected by the provincias. Furthermore, if we look at the powers for the Senate as a whole, they cannot veto national legislation. In comparison, the upper chamber, the Senate, is quite weak compared to upper chambers like in Germany, for example, which have veto powers over many national laws. Now, how do Scotland and Wales exercise their lawmaking authority? First of all, in the House of Commons, the representatives elected in Wales and Scotland, they form separate committees. And even before devolution, these separate committees came together with the responsible ministers. For example, health ministers who wanted to implement some hospital reforms. And then they discussed with these committees the implementation of that law in Scotland or in Wales. Right? So this was already a kind of authority exercised even before devolution. Now, after devolution, certain, so Scotland and Wales got their parliament, respectively, assembly, and certain competences, policies were devolved to the parliament and assembly. But there was also an informal constitutional rule labeled the Sewell Convention. And what does the Sewell Convention say? That the UK Parliament will not legislate, shall not legislate, on matters which are devolved to Scotland and Wales without its consent. So it can legislate with respect to England, but as soon as national legislation also affects or should be implemented in Scotland and Wales, there will be some kind of consultation and approval, consensus, of the devolved territories involved or being affected. And the most recent Scotland 216 Act formalizes the Sewell Convention. I don't know by heart the Wales 214 Act, but the Scotland 216 Act for sure. Now, fiscal control. The difference between a 1 and a 2 on this subdimension is whether a regional government has a veto on the distribution allocation of national tax revenues. And Navarra has that because the fiscal regime of Navarra is laid down in an agreement, convenio, and it's when an amendment needs to be approved by both parliaments, so the Cortes as well as the Parliament of Navarra, and both have veto rights with regard to the convenio. Furthermore, this annual contribution from Navarra to the central government is negotiated every 5 years by a commission which is based on parity between the region and Spain as a whole. And then furthermore, there's also an arbitration board with a president appointed by central government, but the Supreme Court of Navarra is being consulted on the candidate. And when there are disputes, quarrels, disagreements, then this board will find a solution, an answer to those problems. And again, the board is based on parity, right? An equal number of members appointed by regional government and central Spanish government. Now, there is further scope for more authority for Catalonia, according to our benchmark. So on certain dimensions, scores can be higher for Catalonia. And then I've discussed several examples how this could look like, potentially, how this could be organized. Now, in this third part of the presentation, I would like to share you my thoughts about possible future scenarios for Catalonia, and hopefully then leading up to a discussion. Now, my basic point is that there is a lot of leeway for further autonomy, further authority. But in order to achieve that, one fundamental issue needs to be resolved. And what is that fundamental issue? I compared Catalonia to its peers, its equals. But are it really its equals? Right? Scotland, Wales, Åland Islands, Faroe Islands, are it really, truly its equals? Now, what we also do with the Regional Authority Index is to conceptualize types of regions. Right? So often, regions are part of a regional tier, and autonomy, authority is organized in the same way for all those regions consisting or being part of that regional tier. But there are deviations sometimes from this kind of standard institutional framework. A first deviation is what we label an autonomous region. An autonomous region has a bilateral association with the central government. It's actually not part of a standard institutional regional tier framework. It has its own autonomy arrangement, its own authority arrangement. And it's really treated as an individual special jurisdiction. A second deviation from this standard tier is an asymmetric region. A lot of its authority is organized according to this common framework, but with one or two dimensions, an exception is being made. And often that exception is more authority than the other regions within that tier. And then finally, a dependent region. There's actually an anomaly not in terms of more authority, but actually less authority. And often that's the case with former colonies. So a jurisdiction that's subject to central state control, whereby the central government clearly dominates over the regional government, and often these are regions which are quite far away, geographically quite far away from the state. How am I doing with time? 5 minutes more. I need to speed up it. So this is how what I just said before can be visualized. So an asymmetric region is part of a common institutional framework, but on one or two dimensions it's a bit different. An autonomous region has its own authority arrangement and stands in direct relation to the central government, right? But on a kind of equal basis. That's why you see two arrows there, whereas a dependency is actually ruled by the central government. Now, why is this distinction a bit important? Because if we look at how authority is organized, right, what we then see is that autonomous regions tend to emphasize self-rule. And when they have shared rule, it's actually to protect the self-rule component, the autonomy component. For example, Åland has special arrangements with the Finnish government when it comes down to fisheries when fisheries are being discussed in the EU. And why is that? Well, for Åland, it was this island with a lot of water around it. Fisheries are central to its economy. So as soon as fisheries are being discussed at the EU level, the minister responsible for fisheries in Åland replaces the minister responsible for fisheries in the central government. Right? So that's a kind of shared rule arrangement, but clearly aimed, targeted to protect its autonomy, what is especially important for that region. Now, if we look at Catalonia's current autonomy arrangement, it's more of a asymmetrical nature than this autonomy nature. Right? But the examples I provided you are all examples of special autonomous regions. So basically, if Catalonia wants to have more authority, it needs to find a way to break out of the institutional mold it's currently in, right? And it really needs to, reconceptualize its the way it conceives of authority. Now, I'm running out of time because I also wanted to say a bit about debates. Once you debate autonomy, you also intensify political competition. But I have to skip that, so I'll just go, unfortunately, to the end. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discuss my thoughts further with you. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, Professor Shackle. Thank you very much, Professor Shackle, for this wonderful presentation. We learned a lot. Passo la paraula al professor Requejo, que actuarà com a discasen d'aquesta presentació, i després de la seva intervenció obrirem un torn de paraula per poder discutir entre tots la presentació. Professor Requejo, quan vulgui.
Thank you very much. Moltes gràcies a l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern per estar altre cop amb vosaltres i poder discutir i compartir algunes qüestions. Broadly speaking, I think that to have indexes is always welcome in political analysis, no? We know that accuracy in empirical data is not enough, but I think that is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for good research. Why? Because I think that to try to quantify political events, improve accuracy in descriptive works, improve the quality potentially in explanatory hypotheses or even in prescriptive approaches to these kind of things. So I think that it's good to have descriptions of political systems with a double level of government beyond what is established in constitutions and legal rules, that sometimes these legal procedures are sometimes misleading. When we want to know what or how a political system really works. So quantitative method, I like quantification because I studied an engineer degree many years ago. So to quantify problems is important for political discussion. It's different if we know that a problem is like this, or the same problem using the same words is like this. So I think that improve rationalization in political discussion. Well, this specific approach, I think that this is an approach which shows an analytical and methodological ambition to try to quantify this concept of, I will comment something about the logic things related to this concept of regional authority. It tries to do some kind of synthetic concept. I think that it's important. It's important. So I knew your work written in first publication of your book with 2 other colleagues, published in 2010, I think. But here my role is to act as a discussion. So to show some advantages and disadvantages and to introduce some criticisms about your specific approach. I will introduce, because, well, time always flies, you know, this kind of events. 2 kind of criticisms based on 2 different spheres of research. Political theory, concepts, and comparative politics. Even taking into account other researchers and, well, published in the last, say, 10 years about this kind of things. The problem with rational problems is that they can criticize rationally. And the problem with ambitious projects is that they can fall down from a higher distance, you know. So I want to point out these 2 criticisms. The first criticism is conceptual. I think the concepts matter. And a very well-known risk of quantitative methods in general, not only in this related to federations, quantitative methods, is that there are many articles, even published in very, very prestigious journals, etc., that trying to talk with an extreme accuracy about we don't know exactly what. That is, to introduce quantification is not always related to an accurate and a very informative final analysis. If you take the analysis of regional states and federations in the last 10 years, we can at least distinguish between 5 different axes of analysis. For example, it's important to introduce distinctions, like, for example, if we are talking about uninational or plurinational federations or regional states, to distinguish between if we are talking or our interest, our research question is linked to know about the degree of federalization of one political system. That is, how federal is a federation? This is a relevant, I think, question mark, which is different of the research question of how decentralized is a political system. If you compare 2 countries, say Spain and Germany, for example, all the analyses say that the degree of decentralization of these 2 countries is not very different, but the degree of federalization is really, Germany is much more federal than Spain. I say that because to try to capture many things using only a single concept, like regional authority, I think that this is misleading. This is misleading. Why? Because all these different axes require to introduce a diverse battery of concepts, variables, and indicators. If you are interested in measuring decentralization, you have to measure specific things. If you are interested in measure the degree of federalization, you need a different kind of variables. To try to aggregate these two variables in order to obtain a single figure related to a country, I think that this is a bit confusing according to my perspective. For example, in my own research, I discovered that plurinational federations have a degree of federalism which is lower than the uninational federations. And this deserves some kind of explanation. So my first critic point is the concept of regional authority. I think that this is a completely unclear concept. And to try to quantify this concept is to introduce, to go in a travel, you know, with a not a very good chip, so to speak. Even the analysis of symmetries deserves, I think, more accuracy, because we have to distinguish at least three kinds of different asymmetries: factual asymmetries, legal asymmetries, and outcome asymmetries. And all these three kinds of asymmetries deserve specific indicators. So to talk about asymmetry in general, I think it can be wrong. To finish this first point, I think that this concept of regional authority, as I said, is not very clear, because it's convenient to disaggregate it in different variables in order to obtain really informative conclusions from a comparative politics perspective. So diverse here, if I have understood it correctly, diverse independent variables seem to have been reduced to a set of numbers in a simple scale. So I am doubtful that this is a good path to obtain relevant. That if to try to reduce complexity is good, but to try to reduce complexity very much, probably the kind of conclusions are not very relevant. Well, I skip to the second criticism. The second criticism I would like to introduce is related to the application of the English to specific cases. How these kind of variables have been applied in this research. Well, part of your ambition in this research is to take many countries together. That is, the sample is very wide, but includes unitarian states, federations, regional states, etc. Different kind of federations, asymmetrical, symmetrical, etc. No? And I wonder if this is the most promising way for comparative analysis. That is, a very established conclusion for a good comparative research is to compare apples with apples and pears with pears. And my final impression in this research is that you are comparing things to eat: fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, shellfish, etc. So, I'd like to introduce here borrowing a suggestion from a very different field of research, which is political theory, and more specifically, what is defended by some philosophers regarding the socioeconomic theories of justice. If you take the first John Rawls' work, Rawls defends that it's convenient all the time as a good methodological tool to be aware about the final conclusions of what is a pretended very rational approach. And he defends to introduce what he calls the reflexive equilibrium process. That is, always to contrast the principles of the methodological basis of the research with the final conclusions finally achieve. Because sometimes there are some anti-intuitive results. So to be aware, this is methodological prevention, to say, be aware with your conclusions. Even when you think that you are implementing a very rational strategy, contrast your final conclusions with your intuitions. For example, if you arrive to the conclusions, I invented it, it's not in your research, that, for example, Spain is more federal than the States, probably there will be something wrong in the methodological basis. You know, that's, I think that all the figures are okay, but we have to review probably. I think that from a theoretical perspective, I think that your approach is leaned to fall in what is called the fallacy of abstraction. The fallacy of abstraction. That is, the idea that to think that a theory has achieved a better understanding when it uses a language with the highest degree of abstraction possible. And I think that your concept of regional authority falls in this fallacy. That is, to try to establish a synthesis that trying to collect very different variables, very different indicators in very different countries, which are not apples and apples, it's probably to commit this kind of abstraction. I don't have time to enter into all the variables about share rule and self-rule using your approach. But I would like just, if you can comment later a little bit about why, for example, self-rule have 18 points, for example, and share rule only 12. Why this distribution? Because you have found different, this is an intuitive distribution, or this is based on a more rational approach, analysis. And finally, in relation to the Spanish case, that probably many people here is a bit astonished about the figures that appears on the screen. For example, you associate some powers, health, social service, etc., in the site of the self-rule. But in Spain, this is not self-rule, this is a share rule. Catalonia, for example, has no single exclusive power. All the spheres of government are shared by central government and education, health service, welfare, etc. Final scores. Well, at the end of the day, Catalonia has 14 points out of 18. Well, this seems very good. And even the Basque Country, for example, have 10.5 out of 12 regarding shared rule. This is even better. It seems that we live in some kind of decentralized paradise. Probably your figures will be very welcome by the Spanish central government. That is, Mariano Rajoy will be very happy if he knows about your records, you know. And it seems that, for example, the secessionist movement in Catalonia, with this current stake, as formed by crazy people, because they are living in paradise, you know. That this is 14 points in. This is probably related that, according to this reflexive equilibrium defended by Roth, there is something wrong. There is something wrong in the use of these variables, because this is not the final perception, and this is not the final conclusions of political science research which focus on the Spanish state. Research as a case analysis and research according to comparative politics. According to other research, includes myself, Catalonia has a medium degree of decentralization, according to the standards, and has a low profile in the degree of federalization. And when you reduce everything to a single index, and you associate this index in this empirical case with high scores, I think that at least this is surprising. This is surprising, in contrast with other research. Finally, we say, what about Catalonia with its pairs? And you mentioned, for example, Island, or the Faroe Island. Well, I think that this is not a promising path, because in comparative politics, islands have a different kind of dynamics, you know. For example, when we compare federations, along the 23 federations that are now in the world, more or less, federations which are archipelags, for example, Comoros in Africa, St. Kitts and Nevis in America, or Micronesia in the Pacific Ocean, are excluded of this comparison. Why? Because islands have a different thing. It can't be compared easily with the mainline federations. So, to sum up, and I finish now, I think that this research shows some flaws regarding concepts, is prone to commit the fallacy of abstraction from a logical perspective, mixes different empirical cases that deserve specific approaches separately, and mixes also different analytical axes that also deserve different kinds of variables and indicators to have a more, say, informative set of political science conclusions. I like quantification. I like comparative politics. I like to try to reduce complexity to a single models, but not so single, because if it's so single, I think that the final conclusions are easily wrong. So this is my first comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Requejo, for this honest discussion of the presentation. I asked Professor Shackle for a brief reaction if possible, but I would like to save time to open the floor and collect more comments. So if you want to react in five 5 minutes if possible.